welcome everybody to another episode of React Wednesdays. My name is TJ Van Tol. I work as a developer advocate here at Progress. And with me today, I'm excited to welcome Christian Pillsbury. Christian, welcome. Welcome back. You're our returning champion on React Wednesdays.
Yeah.
Well, today, this should be pretty fun. I've got a fancy thing in StreamYard here to show. There we go. We'll be live coding a demo dashboard into a real world app. So you want to sort of set the stage, in theory, right? You want to set the stage for what we're going to be trying to tackle today?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of people will go through tutorials or grab off-the-shelf examples, stuff like that, and they'll kind of get like some pretty impressive stuff in place. But then when they try and like migrate it over to like, how do I make this actually realistic? There's a lot of stuff that usually isn't covered, and understandably so, in a particular tutorial. So like in our particular case, I'm going to be working from an example that one of our, we'll say, greener employees built out and wrote a series of blog posts on, using some Kendo React tooling to be able to like basically build a demo of a dashboard style thing. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be trying to migrate it over to something that's a little more realistic. In this case, we're going to be focusing on kind of async data and REST APIs and stuff like that. So that's what we'll be doing here.
Well, cool. If you want to, you can just go ahead and pop up your screen to get started. And yeah, I like this topic quite a bit because I'm usually on the end of the person who writes these sort of demo apps. And I can tell you for sure, the questions we get all the time is like, okay, well, now I want to know what's next, because you're never going to be able to download one of these things and actually like legit use it, right? You're always, even if you're lucky enough to find the demo that's like super suited to what you need, you absolutely have to take some of these steps to customize it, make it your own, all those types of things. So absolutely, let's do this.
Awesome. Screen sharing working okay?
Yep. We see
right.
Pizza-O-Matic.
Yeah, so this is, like I said, this was built out by one of our employees, Mickey. He was demoing some of the features of Kendo React, but the concepts are going to be applicable for a lot of things. So the basic idea is we have this demo app showing like different kinds of ratings, different categories of ratings. We've got this table view or grid view, and then we've also got a chart view. And then we can look at some region-specific stuff. And these are kind of summaries of the company-wide of PizzaCo, the aggregate ratings. So this is just basically a lot of data transform and stuff like that. So if we actually look at the code, it's pretty straightforward. We've got an app that's broken up into our banner. This is our banner. And then the main view, that's everything else. And then inside the main view, that's kind of where we're grabbing our data. This line is going to be relevant. So if we look here, all of our data is basically coming from this one place where we're just grabbing some JSON and using it. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and this is pretty common because the demo app, they're not going to want to build up a like robust backend for this. There's just going to be some hard-coded JSON in here behind the scenes. So
Right. And so this is just getting passed around to our subsections. So here we've got our regions. So this is data driven. That's worth calling out. So this is the only thing that we don't need any data for, because it's whatever everything means. And then we're going to grab our regions and get information from there. And based on the region we select, which is going to have something like an ID, it's going to determine the data on the way down. As a result, I'm going to call out this other guy here. So one thing we're doing here is, if I can find it, in the panel, we're going to do something really simple. So we're checking like, which view is selected here. Is it a chart view or not? We just did a simple Boolean. You can make that beefier. But then we're just saying, okay, if there's no region ID, i.e. if we've selected all regions, which isn't going to have a region ID, we're going to show the company-wide view. And otherwise, we're going to show the region view.
Okay.
Then the only difference between those two views is what are we doing to the data? So if we note here, we're passing, like I said, we're passing the data around and then just doing some transforms. But these are basically going to look the same. So that's the high level for all that stuff.
Makes
So
sense.
cool. And so this is just like different transforms of all one big bulk of data, or looking at subsets of the data or whatever. So what as I touted, what we're going to try and do is migrate this over to being a little more realistic and a little more production ready for REST. So in order to do that, we don't need to really reinvent the wheel or anything like that. There's a ton of code that people have already solved a lot of these problems. And as long as you know who solved the problems and how they solved the problems, a lot of this stuff ends up being really easy. So step one is, hey, in order to make this a little more like it's working with a client and a server, what we want to do is make sure we're using something that's assuming the data is going to come in asynchronously. And we want to do something that's kind of anticipating migrating to some kind of client-server interaction. And there's a really awesome library out there. It's called React Query. I believe that the author of the React Query, Tanner, was a guest on React Wednesday. Is that correct?
We have, yep. Awesome. Tanner is a friend of the show.
Awesome. Cool. So in order to do it, all we need to do is, let's go ahead. I'm using Yarn here. Well, if I can, let's actually add it.
Yeah, React Query is pretty fun. We had Tanner at DevReach, which was an event we did last week as well. So if you look up, it's probably in the Twitch like videos listing, you could find Tanner talking about React Query at DevReach. It was pretty cool. It's a pretty awesome library. And,
yeah.
And you're saying too, while you're getting this set up, basically, as your first step, you're going to keep the data hard coded, but sort of start by pretending that it's not, more or less, or making it seem like you're interacting with a server.
Yep, exactly. Because if we do this in these kinds of steps, what that allows us to do, going back to our original here, is it allows us to start solving the problems in the right order. So we don't need to solve everything all at once. So step one is just like, let's make the data async, and async using something that's like ready for REST API. So in this case, it's going to be something like, and I've got some handy guys here. So we're not going to go too deep into the details of this, but this is going to be a hook that is provided from React Query to make data fetching really easy. And so the idea here is we need to give it some kind of function. The function will need to be asynchronous, and we need to give it some kind of key that lets it know this is the same request or this is a different request. And we'll get into some of the details on how the keying works, but basic idea is really simple. This can just be as simple as a string. So in our case, it's going to be region or regions, doesn't really matter. And then it's going to return some object with a bunch of handy information, like is it loading, the data itself, and then some other things. But like I said, we need an async function. But we don't have an async function. We just had data. So let's go ahead and get an async function in place. And while that's going, let's go ahead and restart this in the background since I had to do an install. So we're going to save this, and we're going to get an error because we don't have an async function, but let's make one. So let's go ahead.
And is this essentially just going to be like a callback sort of deal, or is this the thing that's actually going to like get the data?
This is going to get the data. So it's effectively yeah. So it's effectively going to be something that is needs to use async, so a promise or declared async, and then eventually resolve to something. Okay. So that's the basic idea here. So in order to do that, I've got, let's call it, I don't know, fetch data factory. All right, so this is basically what I'm going to do here is we need something to be async, and we want it to be realistic enough to be like a REST request, so a fetch, for example. So in order to do that, we can rely on some guys like set timeout and stuff like that. So this is basically just going to be a handy thing to have available. You don't have to use this. This is just minimally solving the problems that we need to do. And instead of writing it over, I will just go ahead and dump it in here. So just quick going over this. This is just a factory function for producing functions that will expect to get some kind of success function, aka something that will give us, if the request, in scare quotes, was successful, yield whatever this function returns, and if it failed, yield this. So this is just using a promise, wrapping it in a timeout for some delay with some configuration. Again, the details of this aren't especially important. It's more just solving that generic problem.
And is that failed function, is that a default parameter there? Is that like just a hard-coded, if somebody doesn't provide it, you just give it that nonsense function?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, that way you don't need to worry about it if you're not using it. I'm just trying to be lazy and say, like, let's provide a bunch of defaults through configuration, and then it'll work for most of the simple cases.
Okay.
All right, so now we have some factory. Now we need to use it somewhere. So we're going to need to actually take, if we recall, in our main view, this originally was just grabbing this JSON data. So let's go ahead and make a function that's going to return the regions. In order to do that, let's go ahead and just throw it in another module here. So we'll call it, I don't know, fetch regions. Ooh.
And I'm curious too, what do you see the benefit of having like the factory for the fetching methods? Is it to like enforce some consistency across the different ways you fetch, or?
It's just solving boilerplate problems. We could, for example, let's go ahead and we'll call this fetch regions, and we don't care about arguments. So in this case,
I see, because you're going to have it. It's even, I sort of get it now, because especially since you're going to be sort of mocking this out, like otherwise you'd have to put that same timeout code and the promise code like all over the place every time you need to get anything.
Yep, just boilerplate crap. So it also allows us to say, like, if we want to change, we'll demo this. Let's see if our app's running in the background. Something mad at us? Oh, it's probably mad at us because we don't have a function yet. So let's go ahead and actually use that function. So remember, all of this was just so that we would have some infrastructure to have some async function that's going to give us our regions.
Okay.
And let's make sure it exists. And it should be rebuilding in the background. And we got one more problem here. Oh, our problem is we don't have good defaulting. So this is the sort of thing that you would expect, because we wrote code that assumes we're going to have synchronous data, but all of a sudden it's asynchronous. So we should be able to easily, again, we're not trying to solve all the problems all the place or in all the places.
So it's trying to render with data that doesn't exist, more or less. That's actually, I like the little trick you did too, the default thing there as well. That's kind of slick.
Yeah, and then realistically, we probably want to break this up into subcomponents and use some. The way I generally handle this is just literally using default props. Like, make sure that the code that shouldn't need to assume certain things exist in one place, and rely on what React is good at to solve those problems. And then everywhere else, we can kind of write the code as async or stuff like that. That way, if we pass down an undefined, it would already be defaulted. And so, yeah. Cool. So now everything is driven from that. So if we reload, we'll actually see something didn't show up. And if we want to make it a little clearer, let's go ahead and go to our fetch regions. And like I said, this has some defaults that we can override. So let's make it a second and reload. And we'll go ahead and see. So it's all asynchronous right now, but it's kind of not great to look at, right? So it takes a while for everything to load, and things are just missing in the app until it's loaded. So in order to get that going, and TJ, let me get your impression. Do you think it would be, or I guess we could ask the audience, would it be better to just fast forward ahead and show how we can like make that fancier, or should we go through the rest of the code base and start migrating the rest of the places that we were looking at, like the panels, all the places where we're doing the data transform? What are your thoughts?
We can see if Chad has any opinions. I'd be fine. Like you're just saying, just skip ahead with the just switching everything over to that boilerplate sort of. I think I'd be okay, just because I think the next steps would be probably a touch monotonous just to switch over to the APIs you already have. So I think if you want to skip forward, I think that's fine.
Cool. Let's do it. All right. So let's go ahead and
actually, this is like one reason why well, I guess if we're starting from a demo dashboard, you can't really do this, but the in theory, if you're writing your own apps, right, you'd want to start with this sort of API in place so that you didn't have to convert all over your APIs over to use that.
Yeah. It's basically just making those functions for the 4 places that I was talking about. Let's do it one more time. There we go. So we can just look at the code for that. So basically, it's just making functions and then using those functions. So this is going to look very similar to what we were looking at. The one difference that we should talk about is one place where we're doing something slightly more complex was the region ratings. Because the regions, if we go back to our company view, the regions actually need to care, or not company view, region view, care about the region ID. So again, we're trying to like make it realistic enough. So when we're using query in this case, we're using a slightly fancier version of it where our key is actually an array of things. So we're getting the ratings, but we're getting the ratings based on some region ID. So we only want the ratings for this region. So that's the step in the direction of something a little more realistic.
Yeah, make sure it's at least passed through because eventually you are going to need it.
Yep, and in fact, we need it for our abstraction. So if we look at the fetch region ratings, this is effectively the function we provided is going to be given all of those keys as arguments. I'll give a little more real estate there. And so this will actually allow us to use that region ID to find, again, we're still just using our JSON data, but this will give us the right data set.
Yep.
Cool. All right, so step 2 is, since we got something that's a little ugly when we load, and let's just make sure everything's still working as expected. We want to make it a little prettier. So I don't know how many people are familiar with React Suspense. It's something that the React folks have been working on for, I think, not quite 2 years now. And it's still technically experimental, but people like Dan Abramov, who originally wrote Redux and works for the React team at Facebook now, there's a GitHub thread I can share around. They're basically like, you can treat it as stable. We have some edge cases that we need to solve, but we're using it in production ourselves. So generally speaking, it's pretty safe to work on right now.
Yeah, and I've toyed with it, but I know I work on the Kenda React team, and so we deal with a lot of people from bigger companies and such, and lots of people just like the assurance of seeing this is stable and official sort of thing, like regardless of whether the actual like code quality and such is there. So
100%.
So we're hoping that there's an official sort of coronation of the feature, right? Like somebody just needs to put the rubber stamp on it that this is actually ready to go. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree and 100% understand that. The decision on whether or not you should be using suspense is definitely something that I understand taking with a grain of salt. And before you migrate, you definitely would minimally want to do some kind of audit, because there are some issues with like some of the state management things, or if you're using this like a lot of third-party stuff that's pretty complex and diving deep into the weeds of some of the fundamentals of React, things might break down. So minimally, you want to like make sure that it's okay to use suspense. But in these kinds of cases, I think it's actually a good idea to assume you will use suspense, and then you can evaluate, okay, if we need to use these other things, are there alternatives that are already up to snuff? Many of these libraries, including, for example, React Query, are already ready to use suspense mode. Same is true for GraphQL libraries and a bunch of other ones out there where people are already like on the ball with this stuff. So
I am curious to see what this looks like, because I think because it's still like quote unquote experimental, it gets talked about sort of abstractly a lot. So I'm curious to see how you're going to implement this, just to see it like in an actual like real live running example.
Yeah, definitely. So let's go ahead. So again, because it's not, you're not necessarily going to be using suspense mode and it's still experimental, React Query isn't going to like set it up out of the box. So you have to do some initial configuration with React Query to get it working. So a couple of things. It's got, React Query is a big library. We can dive into the weeds on it, but it's got a lot of configuration stuff, but it's also very usable out of the box. So one of the things we need to do is actually build out a sort of query cache provider to be able to take advantage of this suspense stuff. So in order to do that, we first need to create a query cache object. And this is really just using it for configuration. This is the main reason we're doing it, just so we can set that flag to true.
Okay.
So now we have a query cache and we need to use it. This is pretty standard provider context-y type stuff, if anyone's familiar with that. You use it with like Redux, you use it with React Router. So really what we want to do is make sure that we are using a query cache provider, and we got our parameter. It's already named the right thing. So we just want to make sure that we're wrapping this in this. Let's see if our app, probably need this to be running. So we'll keep moving forward as we're doing this. So all this is doing is saying like we're doing some not just out of box version of how we're going to configure the sort of top level React Query infrastructure. And so that's, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's under, so query cache would just be like a query being like a call to get some data, and like the cache would be, because I know React Query has a lot of stuff to like cache your calls and has some intelligence around that. So I'm assuming that's going to come into play here a little bit also.
Yeah, we're actually just using out-of-box intelligence. So in the background, we didn't really focus on this. Probably need to import some stuff for this to work. Let's go ahead and import the things we just added. And see, we'll let that run in the background. All right. Yeah, so we weren't really focusing on that, but like under the hood, we're already relying on local caching, cache invalidation. This is all just provided out of the box. So, and we're not probably configuring everything exactly how we would want to. Let's take a look. Oh, we need a suspense to be able to do this. So let's go ahead. Main view suspended. Wow. So we don't have our suspense. So let's just add that real quick. And then we'll keep talking as we're going.
Yeah, you're gonna have to explain to me what that meant, because that went completely over my head.
Oh, so this is actually saying, hey, there was some async stuff going on. So remember, we configured our React query to now assume we're going to be using suspense.
Okay.
And so as a result, the way that when we use query, so it was saying in the main view, when we use query, now it's going to work slightly differently than it was before. Now what it's going to do is it's going to say, while I'm making my request for the data, I'm going to kind of bubble up the information. And this is all magic under the hood. You have to dig into the architecture. You don't really need to understand the details of this, but it's basically relying on promise infrastructure and making sure the promises are being yielded in a certain way up the DOM. And so what's happening is we're now, use query is returning in slightly different ways. And it's expecting something above it to be implementing the suspense wrapper component to catch the fact that this is loading in the background.
Interesting. And so that error was almost like a compiler. I mean, I guess it was runtime, but it's almost like compile time saying, hey, you need to provide this since you're using this API.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And like suspense, you're importing that direct from React, right? That suspense component.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
It's built in. We need to actually load it. So let's not make the same mistake 3 times. And we don't have a. Go ahead.
And do you need, like, since it's experimental, is it shipping in like production React, or like did you have to do something special to get a React that has suspense importable from it?
Yep, we're using experimental.
Okay.
Yep, that's what I was doing back here.
Makes sense.
Yep, and that's where when I was talking about the whole long thread, there's a very long thread on GitHub about this, but.
And this is like a branch that's maintained, right? So like presumably new React stuff goes into the experimental stuff and such.
Yeah. They're going to be very cautious about breaking changes in this experimental branch for a long time because they're using it, and other people they don't want to make it so that people are pissed off at Facebook and the React team as they're trying to like migrate to what the future of this ecosystem is.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So they're working. There's lots of third-party libraries that are trying to like update to be able to use the experimental, and so they're going to keep it fairly stable. They might be adding additional things and stuff like that, but I don't think they're going to do any breaking changes for what's like core to the ecosystem.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so our error is gone, and it was as simple as wrapping this in a suspense. And like I said, if we load now, still not beautiful, but if we load, see how it said loading. And in fact, if we want to demo that again, let's go ahead and just again, let's make this a little longer. So we're still using our fake data, but we can at least make it a little more realistic and take advantage of the ecosystem.
Now, is that going to show up for like each spot that needs it? How is it that we're just seeing one loading text there?
This is part of the magic of the way suspense works. Basically, what's happening is these async things that are like returning the sorts of promise information internal to React in the way that like lets everyone know this is a suspense situation. Will bubble up to where the first suspense had happened. So it's basically using the VDOM structure, looking for. So if we wanted to.
It's interesting because I would have totally, if you would have asked me before you ran that, I would have expected to see loading like in each of those slots where data is coming from, right? Like instead of it knowing that like these things are going on simultaneously and only need to show it once sort of thing.
Yeah, so I mean, if we want to see it, we'll look at, actually, let's do it in panel. So I tend to prefer to keep these external. It's similar to what I was talking about with like where we move the pieces and where we would do defaulting. If we wanted to componentize this later, I would do this, and we'll just do loading again, or we'll call it another loading. And so if we reload now, well, it helps again. I'm going to keep doing this. Actually import it. I'm just using keyboard shortcuts.
I see. So you can, it's pretty granular, it looks like, because you can nest these things if you want more specific, like if you need to customize the handling of it. That's interesting. I didn't realize it worked that way.
Yep. And in fact, so we saw loading. It was too quick here.
Yeah, you didn't delay that one.
Yeah. Go ahead and do, what is it? Fetch hitting summary, I believe. And we'll make this also delay. We'll make it 2000. One thing to keep in mind is once you're using suspense, we're not even making a request until this is rendered. So it didn't even start unless, I mean, there's some magic that React Query can help with, but basically you're not rendering until it's ready. And so each level of suspense, you might need to pre-query, and React Query can solve some of those problems for you. But you might actually be doing a lot of deferring all the way down, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, you want to get sufficient information before you go to the next level down, and get sufficient information, go to the next level down. But if you can prefetch in these situations, you would want to start doing that. And those are just additional refactors you would do.
Very cool.
Cool. What do you think? Another fast forward, or?
Yeah, because basically, well, I guess what needs to change at this point if you want to bring this across we do have some people in chat saying no fast forward. So we could probably go through and show how you're going to convert this. Because I actually am curious how you define that like global suspense sort of thing. I'm curious how that sort of gets down to the rest of the app.
Yeah, so I mean, this is just, we've already got something that will catch any suspended things. It's just right now, it's only going to catch it at wherever its ancestor suspense is. So we've got two in place right now. One wrapping this in our panel right here, right?
Yep.
And one at the top level. So the only other place we really need to do it is here. And the reason we only need to do it one other place is because this series view is either going to be, nope.
This happens to me all the time. My boss's name is Sarah too, which like every time I have to answer her on a call or something, it triggers it off. And while you're doing this too, we did have a question in the chat of if there's going to be a repo on this. This is up on GitHub. So if it's out there, we could share it at some point at the end or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I don't think it's public yet, but we can easily make it public. Yeah, that wouldn't be a problem whatsoever.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. So, and I'll probably do a blog post on it or something like that. So we'll be able to revisit all of this stuff.
Okay.
So going back here, remember, we're basically saying if we got a region ID, aka if we're selecting one of the regions, note the loading, by the way, that's because it's reloading. So
oh, yep.
It's not reloading here, but it is reloading here sometimes. So this is all black magic under the hood for use query making out-of-box decisions on when to refetch and when not, blah, blah, blah. So these are wrapping a region view and a company view. And remember, the region view is one place we're making one query, and the company view is just making a slightly different query to get the data. So since those are being decided here, we just need to wrap it one time right here for our last suspense, right? And we'll say main content loading. And so we'll reload one more time. And it was quick, so if we want to see it less quick, we can go.
Yeah, delayed again. I caught it. I do like this is, so like I said, I hadn't seen this actually in action before. And this is surprisingly elegant because I think everybody's got code like this because you show loading indicators in your app. It's like one of the most common things.
Yep.
And usually you have some like manual, usually not the funnest logic to write that does this. Like you either have like a is loading state Boolean variable or something like that. And that's great when you have like one thing, but then when you have like, well, there's 8 things actually loading on this page, all of a sudden it's like, well, crap, what do I have, like 8 Booleans, or how am I going to reconcile all of these things loading at the same time?
Yeah, and given, like you were saying earlier, I was being lazy, by the way, and just changing the defaults so that we can see everything loading.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so since this is a different fetch, it's got to reload. But if we go back to the previous one, since we just fetched that, this is all, again, black magic configuration from React Query. Like I said, we can stand on the shoulders of giants for all of this stuff.
Yep.
But to your point earlier about being a little cautious about moving to experimental stuff and using suspense since it's technically experimental, you were talking about Booleans. One of the things I'm not demonstrating here is of the many, many useful things that come with React Query, they also, for every single query you're using with use query, and similarly with use mutations, which are about like posts and stuff like that, they're going to give you both an is loading and an is fetching, which are two slightly different things because it might be loading data that you've already cached, or it might actually be refetching data. And so you can have a per request like Boolean and use it in that way instead. So if you are a little leery on using suspense, React query can also help with that stuff without using suspense.
Okay.
All right. So, I mean, we didn't fast forward. We're done with moving suspense for every single request. If we want, we could actually make our. I've got a slightly fancier version. If we want to actually go ahead, let's go ahead and demo that. Yeah, we're
fancier in terms of API or fancier in terms of just visuals of how it works.
Just a slightly fancier loading component because we were just dumping a string in there. But remember. Or maybe not remember, if we look here, this is just a fallback renderer. So the default I had in there was component.
Yeah, yeah.
So what we're going to do is we're going to make a loading component. And I just stole some. This is not ideal for what we're trying to demo, but it's good for global level stuff. I just stole some styles from that Kendo React. Since we're using Kendo React here, we can just do a loading component. And if we look here, all it's doing is creating a loading mask. This is all just styles. It's
yep.
Yeah.
The latest version of Kendo React, there's actually a loader, or it's either loader or loading component that's top level now.
Oh,
to make this a little bit cleaner.
Good to know. Is that one of the new 4 release things?
Yeah, it's in the latest release. I can't remember which exact package it's in, so you can keep it the same for now. But just FYI, it exists. You'd probably turn that 4 lines of code into 1 line of code at least. It's a small little thing.
Yeah, that's really good to know. I was hesitant to migrate to 4 because of the new license key stuff.
Oh, yeah.
This one's been migrated, so we're just going to migrate the rest of them. So I'll be lazy and just grab these guys, and we're going to migrate them to using. Again, this is going to be sort of a mask on top of entire app, so it's not ideal, but it'll work.
Yeah, I know one of the things that's nice about, I know Tanner talked about this with use query, is you can provide, like, you can know query level whether something's loading, but you can also know like app level whether anything is doing some fetching. So if you wanted to do the sort of thing where you showed like a little spinner in the corner or something, just to let the user know like something's happening here, right? Like just so, because I actually find that kind of useful in the apps that I do, because like it's a way of knowing like, oh, maybe whatever I'm trying to do isn't quite ready because clearly something's happening, sort of deal. So it's kind of nice for that sort of use case.
Right. And you know, if you did want to wait for everything, this isn't horrible. So if we reload, we've got our slightly longer delay here. It's rendering as it comes in and then keeping the mask up until everything's done, so to speak, right?
Yep, a little bit nicer.
Yeah. All right. Any suspense questions, or should we move to the next stage?
I definitely enjoyed that. If anybody in chat has any questions about suspense and how it's used here, feel free to ask them, and I will run them by Christian. But if you want to just transition into got some people that enjoyed it. So cool. I think I definitely enjoyed seeing it in action too. So I need to check it out. Yeah. But I also like the idea of going into like error boundaries and error handling as well, though, because that's another thing that I'm not the greatest at.
Not a problem. So if we're going to use error boundaries, we're going to keep standing on giants' shoulders. We got plenty out there. I don't need to reinvent things. So error boundaries, high level, basically an error boundary. It's similar to the way suspense works. Basically, you have some sort of like ancestor component that's saying, I am defining an error boundary. And then there's some, again, black magic under the hood for React where it will, if it throws an error, it's going to catch it and then say, okay, when I find my error boundary, the error boundary is going to tell me what to do with this. And that'll include like rendering a different component if it encounters an error. That component may allow you to try and like redo something or contact someone or something like that. It's basically a way of saying like errors happen, in particular, errors happen in client-server communication. How do you handle that? And in fact, just to demo that before, so one of the things I wrote in my
yeah, I definitely have some questions about like common patterns for handling this, but I'm curious to see how you tackle this first, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, so we'll just try and see like, okay, what happens if we get an error? Well, nothing. So this is what would normally happen in the world of React if you get an error. And this is just the promise yielding a reject, and it's saying like, we didn't have anything to handle it. In fact, they're going to say, maybe you should add an error boundary.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is we're going to grab, what is it called? React error.
And so you're using a library because
someone is pretty.
I think we lagged there for a second. I'm curious, like, what is the library just to give you some cleaner APIs for dealing with this? Because presumably you can handle this with just the built-in React stuff.
Yeah, you can. This is basically just creating a component that handles most of the common use cases. That's basically what it's for.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all we're doing there. And so let's make sure we rerun the app in the background while we're going. So in order to use error boundaries, let's start at the top again. So we'll go back to our app, and we've got our suspense, and we've got our provider for the React query cache. We just need to do some more wrapping. That's effectively how you solve these problems. So the next step is going to be, we're going to need to first make sure that we wrap there's two more things that we want to do. And technically, we don't have to do one of them at the app level, but this is good for demonstration purposes. Again, we're going to need to do some React query specific stuff, and then we're going to actually add the error boundary stuff. So in order to do that, we'll want to wrap both the suspense and the main view, because the suspense is going to catch it while it's loading. And then if it's loading and then gets an error, it's going to bubble up to the error boundary. So if you think about like why we're nesting it in the particular way we are, that's why.
Is there a reason like you wouldn't put it just as the most global thing? Like, in theory, couldn't something go wrong with the banner? Maybe not, but
yeah. So there's no reason why we couldn't put this here. It's just this is just static content. This is just display only stuff. So that's the only reason it's here.
I see. And like probably since it is static, you probably would even want to show the banner on like some sort of error page as well.
Yeah. Or you want to let the banner still show up even if an error occurs is another way to think about that, right?
Okay. Yep. I'm with you.
Yeah. So you want to still show your branding, right?
You want to let them know whose error it was. So
right. So this is doing a lot of stuff. So we'll spend a little time here. I'm going to move the code that should be in there. So let's format it first. So this is going to be, we'll go ahead and for now, let's just comment that out.
Okay, so first question while you're doing this, the syntax you're using here is specific to React query. So does error boundary, the library, like have specific integration with React query? Is that why this is happening? Or is okay.
So React query, so like I said, this actually isn't necessary at the top level. What this is doing, so remember when we were talking about suspense, and you were saying like, hey, why does the suspense work even though we're making a bunch of different requests, right? And what's going on there? So React query allows you to say, hey, if an error occurs from some query, let's scope what it means to reset for a query. So if you don't define anything, it's going to go up to the top level. But what that means is if you don't define anything, if any error occurs with any request, reset is going to reset all of the requests.
Okay.
And so the idea here is, even though this is the top level, this is the sort of pattern you'd want to follow all the way down for everything else. And in the end, you'd probably want to get rid of this. But what this is allowing you to do is say, here's a boundary for me encountering an error, and what it would mean to reset it for React query to basically retry the query.
Okay. So yeah, you sort of anticipated my question, like what is a reset here? But it's sort of up to you to define what a reset means. Is that
Yep.
Okay?
Yep. And in fact, we're gonna throw a component in there that will at least give us a button to reset it. Because right now we have no mechanism for actually resetting the error boundary. So let's make sure we reset the error boundary.
Well, that's what I'm sort of curious about, is like what action you could take here. Like, because I was sort of picturing you just throwing up like an error occurred, context support or something like that, pretty generically.
Yeah. So if we we'll talk through the actions to take. So let me.
Okay.
So there's a few moving pieces here. One is we need a component that tells us we want to reset or retry or something like that. That's all this is. It's a dialogue. Again, it's just using some kind of React crap to say, let's retry that request. And in here, maybe you would like have a retry count. You can do all sorts of fancy stuff there. But from the perspective of React query, the idea of reset means we have tried a request, it failed. Should we try again? Right?
That's interesting. Yeah, I could see, and actually come to think of it, like I think it's becoming more common for apps to give you a way of doing that. Like I'm just thinking, like if I'm in Twitter and I'm on a train and I go through a tunnel, it'll tell me like tweets can't load, but then it'll throw me a thing like, hey, you want to try getting tweets again, sort of thing.
Right. Exactly. And that's a very common scenario, is you have, intermittent connectivity or network connectivity. That would be a common one. Or maybe there's a load thing, and you don't want catastrophic failures that you can't recover from effectively. That's the idea. And so you would evaluate on a case-by-case basis. But for demonstration purposes, this is how you would tell React query, I want to re-request. And you might want to re-request just as a result of maybe something failed and you navigate away and you navigate back. Do you want to say, for time immemorial with the app running, never retry?
Yeah. And presumably too, I'm probably skipping ahead with this question, but you're defining like a global handler here, but presumably you could also then, kind of like we did with suspense, make it more granular. So if you knew, like in this situation, if this fails, like I can't do anything, so I'm not going to give the user the option, sort of deal, right?
Exactly right. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. But the reason I generally would start at the top level and work my way down is this solves the problem. And if you don't want to solve it throughout the entire app, you've got something that's managing this sort of scenario.
Yeah, and is the reset, like, is it automatically smart enough to know, like, is that retry going to work that you put in there? Is there some React query magic to make it know, like, hey, I already know which one failed and I can just do it again?
Yep.
Okay, so that's pretty awesome.
So we did re-request for one. We do actually need to go down to the lower levels to get it working for all, because if we want to demo this, I added it to my lazy man abstraction. But if we make the default 0 and it's back to 0 and we want to just do it for fetch regions, here we can just say,
just force the region call to fail specifically.
Yeah. What did I call that property?
I don't know. I'm horrible with names. Fail count. Yeah.
All right. So now we've got just the region will fail.
It's pretty, yeah, and you're showing it in a dialogue, but really, like, if you were, you could make it show up like right in the area that you wanted to if you needed to do that.
Yep. Yep, that's exactly right. And same with the loading. It's the same idea as the loading. It's just, this is the component. It's going to be in your VDOM structure, just like any other React component. So in the scenario, like with suspense, it's when I encounter something async happening, render this until that thing is done. And in the case of error boundaries, it's when I encounter an error through this infrastructure, render this, and then because React query says, hey, we can try again, that will allow you to say, I'm going to be back in the loading state. So if we go through this one more time, we're going to load. It's going to be loading. So the loading indicator, that's the suspense fallback. Then this shows up because we threw it, we received an error. We're going to retry, and it's back to suspense. So these are just different fallbacks built out from using the error boundary with the suspense together.
Yeah, and customizable, like you have your you have your global handler, but you have the granularity to get in there and specify things or configure things.
Yep.
Actually, can you show like the retry stuff again? Like I'm pretty amazed that it automatically knew the correct call to retry. And like, could you show me exactly where that's happening? Because this is blowing my mind just a little bit.
Yeah, this is basically, other people have already solved these things, so I don't need to, is basically what it amounts to. So one, we're relying on this guy, which is part of React query. So
Okay.
this is defining from the perspective of React query. Here we are bounding what is like the errors we encounter, and it's going to automatically give you some callback that you can invoke to try and reset to try again.
I see. Okay, that's the part that I did not get the first time. That line 26 there, that reset was coming from React Query. Like it was automatically giving you a function that did it.
Yep.
And okay, so then on like line 28, potentially you could do it differently, right? If you wanted to say, actually, like maybe do that reset function, or maybe not, maybe tweak it a little bit. You have the power there, but by default, you could just use the default React query thing and let it do its thing.
Yep, yep. So this is giving us the reset function. Error boundary, which is another third-party thing, has a way of saying, like, did something get reset? It's going to then give you, like, if we encounter an error, if an error bubbles up to us, we should invoke this. This, it's worth calling out, this is just a React component. That's all that is. That, again, error boundary is going to give you a function. So this is just 2 levels down now. It's going to give you a function that your component can invoke to reset the error boundary.
Right, and the error dialog is the thing you wrote, but in your own apps, you could make that whatever made sense for your own app.
Exactly. And so this isn't telling the error boundary that I want to reset the error boundary. In the end, that's going to invoke, because we're resetting the error boundary, that's going to invoke React Query's reset function, which for this particular case means if we go back to the thing we haven't seen for a very long time, this is the thing that threw the error. So now the error boundary from React Query finally got invoked, and it's going to say, all right, let's retry. So all it's going to do is rerun this query.
But you didn't have to, like, you as a developer, I mean, you need to know in like the back of your head sort of what's happening, but you didn't have to explicitly write any of that out, which is kind of slick.
Yep. Yep. You can just like, and in fact, this is the sort of stuff that this nesting, this is going to be a common pattern. So this is something you could break out into its own component so that you can reuse it. As you've been seeing, I've written snippets to do it, so I don't have to think about it. Right? You can do whatever makes the most sense for you. it's always a double-edged sword of like there's a lot of black magic going on with this, but it's also black magic that is like solving really complex problems that you don't even have to think about.
Yeah, it's one of those classic programming dilemmas of like when you're teaching someone, sometimes you want them to go through the manual pain so that you understand, like, because everybody that's written or tried to write this sort of stuff before without any of this can appreciate exactly how much this is saving for you, because like just the simple, like just take one tiny part of this, like retrying a request is
Yep.
is is way more complicated than you might think it is. So to just be handed a function that does it is pretty slick.
Right. And retrying a request that has caching in place. So also doing cache invalidation and error state management versus data state management. So it's doing all of that stuff. Managing the async data. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like over time too, like I've leaned on just encouraging people to just use the tool that solves the problem, because at the end of the day, you want to be as productive as possible and you don't want to get in the weeds, because for the most part, like, sure, like we could all learn the ins and outs of assembly code, and there are some real benefits to knowing that stuff, but you're better off probably just ignoring that stuff exists and getting better at using the things that just make you most productive at getting your job done, getting apps built.
Yeah, and we try and strike a balance there. We have extensive training for all of our employees, and so we try and make sure that they understand what's going on, and so we'll do deep dives into, React's VDOM reconciliation, and we'll go into like how context providers and consumers work and blah blah blah. But we kind of try and like meet in the middle. So we use this, and then we would from here say like, all right, now let's try and understand how this all works.
Yeah, I think it's a good balance too, because there are times where you're going to get a weird error message. And if you at least like conceptually understand what's going on, it's sometimes super important. Like I'm not an expert on some of these React features because I'm fairly new to React, but I spent a ton of time with the DOM. So like if something goes wrong on the DOM, sometimes it's nice to be able to go like, oh, I have an idea of what might be happening here and sort of tweak it and stuff. So that background does come in useful. So there are times where I wish like I understood like the ins and outs of some of these React features a little bit better, but it's one of those things you learn as you need to, and as projects come up and that sort of thing too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and this is the sort of thing where like these are, I mean, you can deviate from these and you might need to expand on them and you might need to learn some of the details of like what's going on. So like I said, we're relying on baked in cache validation and refetching and stuff like that. Probably you'd want to go through and like optimize that around the scenarios per case and knowing how likely it is the data is going to change and blah, blah, blah. But you don't need to do that to get everything working. And then you can, from there, like improve on it. Like that's effectively what this is in a way, right?
Yep. Well, cool. We're coming up to the top of the hour here. So if Chad has any questions about anything that Christian's built today or anything, please chime in so we can ask any last minute questions. But Christian, do you want to like show like your GitHub or any places for people to reach out if they have questions? Or you said you were going to like toss this repo out here later, place for people to look and such.
Yeah, I'll have to figure out if we're going to throw it on our company one or my personal one. I've got multiple handles on GitHub, so I've got a digital primates one and a regular one. But you can just the easiest way for now is probably just reach out to me on Twitter. I think my handle is in the it's CJ Pillsbury. Just at me, DM or otherwise.
We did get a request to like maybe quickly summarize some of the topics that you covered, like just like super high level what you've covered and like high level like recommendations around that.
Yeah. So we started with a demo app, just static data. Step one was, okay, let's try and deal with async data. So we ended up using React Query to do that. Highly recommend that. That should be your default unless there's a good reason not to be. So React Query handles all the fetching and stuff like that. but you can also just use it with any old async function, which is what we did. Step 2 was, now that we had something that's handling data as async data, then let's handle using the fact that it's async with React suspense to be able to handle the fact that data is coming over time. So suspense allows us to differentially render for while we're waiting for our data. So step 2 was updating our use of React query to handle suspense, and then using the React suspense context. Step 3 was handling error cases. So when our attempts to get data ends up returning with an error, how do we handle that in an elegant way instead of just having our app crash? So what we did there is we grabbed an off-the-shelf component called React Error Boundary, I believe it's called, and then use that, again, updating the way we're using React Query to be able to reset or re-request or retry fetching the data for cases where we got an error, let's try again. And so that step 3 was, how do we recover from error scenarios? Those are the 3. We didn't get to our JSON server. I'll make sure that the code that I share is also going to be available on the JSON server. We'll probably write a blog post on this too. That'll be on digitalprimates.net/blog. We being the royal we, will probably end up writing a blog post on it. So you can check out there too. And we've got other blog posts for other stuff we've been working on.
Cool. Well, Chad enjoyed this. I enjoyed this too. This was a lot of fun. I'm just working on putting in all of the links for the things you talked about in the chat. So we've got basically linked to you on Twitter. We've got React Query, React Suspense, Error Boundary, and the Digital Primates blog if people want to keep up with this. Well, thank you so much. This is a lot of fun. And we might have to do this again because I know you said you had some other features for this. So we might have to stay tuned for a potential part 2 of this. And if you are listening to this, React Wednesdays, this is something we do every Wednesday, as the name sort of implies. So I'll toss a link to this in the chat as well. So we hang out, we do this. Yeah, we got some more thanks from the chat as well. This was a lot of fun. So if you enjoyed this sort of thing, feel free to check back in. We've got a number of, if you look at the site, we've got a number of pretty awesome guests coming up. So cool. Thank you, Christian. Appreciate it. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Until next week. See y'all.
All right. See ya.